and welcome to the second episode of Precision Signals. My guest today is Dr. Michelle Longmire, physician scientist, technologist, and founder of Medable. Michelle grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in a family where science was both legacy and language. Her grandfather worked on the hydrogen bomb and helped define electromagnetic pulse theory. Her father contributed to the Human Genome Project. Her mother was a radiochemist and an expert in plutonium chemistry. Dinner conversations were about biology, energy, big data, and weapon systems. In fourth grade, Michelle bred generations of hamsters to map inheritance patterns because her father thought it would be fun. That foundation of system logic and applied curiosity led her to medicine and then to translational research in dermatology and epigenetics. She earned her MD from the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, completed her dermatology residency at Stanford, and later joined faculty, where she focused on autoimmune skin disorders and molecular diagnostics. But over time, Michelle began to see the clinical trial ecosystem for what it was: opaque, inefficient, and structurally brittle. While working in the lab during the day, she began building something different at night, a software framework to reconfigure how clinical trials reach patients, collect data, and generate evidence. What began in dermatology exposed a harder truth. One of the most important failure points in drug development is trial infrastructure, and fixing it meant rebuilding the system, not optimizing around its flaws. Today, Medable supports clinical trials in over 60 countries and 120 languages across more than a dozen therapeutic areas. The platform is used by many of the world's leading sponsors and CROs, and its work now extends from protocol orchestration to long-term patient follow-up, underpinned by AI and real-world integration. In our conversation, we explore how to apply technology where it matters most, not as disruption, but as discipline, and what it takes to lead that change from inside the system. Let's step into the conversation and trace the signal beneath the noise.
Hi, Sean.
Welcome to Precision Signals.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Great to have you here. Michelle, you've done so much in your career. And what I want to start with is your family background, because I recently found out that you come from a family with an incredible scientific legacy. Your grandfather worked on the hydrogen bomb, if I'm not mistaken. Your father was involved in the Human Genome Project. And your mom was a radiochemist and a plutonium expert. So growing up in that highly academic and intellectually motivating environment, what was dinner table conversation like?
Well, it's just kind of your reality when you're young, and then you get older and you think, wow, that was pretty unique. Los Alamos is a really great place to grow up for a variety of reasons. You're in the mountains, so we were very active from playing ice hockey and skiing, and I was a dirt bike racer. I used to do the New Mexico dirt bike racing circuit. And then to your point or question on family, dinner table conversations, they really often revolved around science. And my mom, very passionate about science and nuclear energy and the opportunity for nuclear energy to be harnessed, really to solve some of the issues around energy availability, as well as her work in weapons. The other is my dad, being a geneticist. He was really the person who kind of took me under his wing and taught me a lot about biology. One of the really fun memories was when I was in fourth grade and we were doing the science fair, and my dad had this wild idea that we should breed multiple generations of hamsters, long and short hair, and then, map it all out and determine what the genetic inheritance pattern was. And so we probably had 4 or 5 generations of hamsters. And, but at the time, I think it was my reality, but I really took so much away from that, period of time and being able to learn from my parents, the scientific process and the beauty of science, and just ultimately the wonders of the world.
Very interesting. So as you mentioned your athletic background, I did a little bit of digging and I found a very interesting story that I just want to make sure it's true. So you've done dirt bike racing, right? Gymnastics also. But then I came across this really amazing story about you having been told at the age of 14 that you were too old to play soccer. But 3 years later, you ended up earning a Division I scholarship. And tell me about that determination. And is that story true?
Yeah, it was probably 13 or 14. I decided I wanted to play soccer. And I had been a gymnast. My little brother was a soccer player. And I thought, gosh, it would be so fun to learn the sport. So I started to play and I loved it, but I was playing rec and I wanted to try out for the competitive team. I'd only been playing for like 6 months. And I was told, you're too old. You're never going to really be able to go anywhere because all of us have been playing since we were 5. However, I'd say, if nothing else, I'm extremely determined and can be hyper focused. So I used to go train on my own for 2 or 3 hours a day. and I would just kick the ball against a wall out at the tennis courts, and I would do footwork. And then, yeah, lo and behold, I ended up getting a Division I college soccer scholarship only a couple of years later. I think it was mostly my determination and not so much my soccer skills. But I was a formidable opponent out there on the field.
That's great. So taking no for an answer goes back to your teen years,
100%,
right?
way before that. If you tell me I can't do something, I'm going to work. If it's something I want to do, I'll probably try very hard to prove you wrong.
And what motivated you to go to med school?
It's interesting. I, again, just love science. And so I essentially was in the last year of undergrad, and I was talking to my dad about pursuing a PhD or an MD, and he was a PhD, and he had always felt that the training in medicine gives you such a unique perspective on human life that you can incorporate into your science. And so he really encouraged me to pursue medicine. His sister was a doctor. And I ended up going that direction. And of course, I, feel that was a really wonderful decision, and his guidance was extremely valuable. I think, the beauty of medicine is, you get such a unique perspective on the human experience. It really helps you prioritize, the problems you want to solve in science. That was really the inspiration, was really just more his guidance. And it ended up becoming just one of the best decisions I've made.
So it seems like you went to medical school and you were on an academic physician scientist track, right? You got your MD from New Mexico and then did dermatology residency at Stanford. So you could have had a very comfortable life as a physician scientist. What was the moment that you realized you needed to leave that ivory tower, if you will? Yeah,
it's interesting. I think since I can remember, I was passionate about building a business, and not for very clear reasons. But my grandfather, he had, as you mentioned, worked on the hydrogen bomb, and he actually is kind of the grandfather of electromagnetic pulse theory. He's the person who figured out when they detonated the bombs in Bikini Atoll why the lights went out in Honolulu. So he became a very famous physicist. However, he later went from Los Alamos to build his own company in Santa Barbara, California, and was an entrepreneur. And I think back to even undergrad and some of my experiences in my summer internships, I thought we should take this and build a company. There's so much more we could do, if we think about the broader impact for humanity outside of the lab. And once I got to Stanford, I don't even know if I knew the word entrepreneur before I went to Stanford. But again, in my work, say at the NIH in medical school as a Howard Hughes research scholar, I wanted to begin thinking about commercializing some of the novel innovations we were working on. So I ended up at Stanford, heart of Silicon Valley, see people building businesses everywhere, was already kind of, it was in my blood and in my bones, and just thought, wow, all these people are doing it. And kind of with this naivete thought, if they could do it, I bet I could figure out how to do it. Not because I was so confident, but I'd proven to myself I could kind of take on things and figure them out. So started Medable, and really its earliest form was focused in dermatology. And it was, I think, a byproduct of being in Silicon Valley and then having this passion for entrepreneurship and businesses, even prior to being there.
Interesting. So it was nature. You were inherently a risk taker, it seems, an entrepreneur in spirit, and then nurture. Seems like the Stanford environment was very motivating.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think it's such a unique environment. When you look around from the medicine side of it and Stanford Medical School all the way, to any other part of Stanford and then Silicon Valley, it has this system effect of being able to, take a person like me and an idea, and then being able to facilitate that person building a company. And, from everything from how you figure out how to incorporate to the fundraising, to the hiring. And it's not this is written down anywhere, but once you start wanting to do it, you meet people who give you the guidance on how to do it. And they're random encounters. Some of the best advice I got was by meeting people at coffee shops, running into people in, Palo Alto. So again, it's not like there's a playbook, but you're surrounded by people doing it. And so therefore you can begin to figure out exactly what to do.
I guess as you have characterized it, I noticed, having listened to some of your interviews, you have to be fearless and stay in the game attitude, yes. Right? But Michelle, I imagine that there must have been moments of uncertainty leaving Stanford to start a company. So how do you reconcile being fearless with being human?
Yeah, I would say I'm not fearless, but I've learned to not let fear be the reason to not do something. So when I was leaving Stanford, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to regret this. I was working with Howard Chang, and he, is a really established and incredible researcher. He's a Howard Hughes medical investigator, institute investigator, he was such an inspiration. I loved the work we were doing in epigenetics. And it was a really fun environment clinically as well. I was working with Dave Fiorentino on understanding scleroderma and systemic sclerosis. And I was able to marry my work in epigenetics with this rare disease. So I was really happy. But I had my side project where I thought research is broken, healthcare is broken. I want to build this technology bridge. So, during the day, working in my lab and research, and at night, starting to build a team that could build this technology. And it really got to this crossroad where I needed to determine what was the right direction for me. And I remember, talking with my parents, and they really wanted me to stay at Stanford. They felt like I had this incredible opportunity in front of me, but my heart told me I wanted to operate in a world where there were really no institutional boundaries and where I could, understand how to make it. And it was up to me to determine that future. So I determined, the right thing to do was to pursue Medable full time. I was able to obtain $3 million of funding so I could pay myself for the first time. I'd already been paying an engineering team. And, the day I left, I was very nervous, but I've never looked back, although I think so fondly upon the experience. And it was so formative to, who I am as a leader, a doctor, and an entrepreneur. So I think, ultimately it was the right decision, but I definitely was scared, but I didn't let it stop me.
Right. Fear.
And you have these loans. my undergraduate was, I had a college scholarship, so I was able to cover some of the costs there. Medical school loans. It wasn't like I didn't have a lot to consider in terms of how I was going to manage some of those financial obligations, but I figured out and found a way to pursue Medable full time and to, be able to handle that overhead by employing myself, which was a pretty scary thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, medical school debt makes a lot of physicians very conservative, and it makes it very hard for them to take risks. So you embarked on this journey a long time ago. When did you start Medable? What year was it?
The first idea that became Medable was actually AI and dermatology, and some of the ideas became Medable. So it was, how do we connect people to dermatologists for care and research? And that then, I pivoted to be something much broader. I remember I went and I pitched Sequoia Venture Capital. This was like 2016. And they said, hey, it was like 2015. They said, derm is like a small area. How would you make this a bigger opportunity? Now, I think ultimately that it was a little ahead of its time and dermatology could have worked out, but their feedback was helpful. And I thought about the problem from a much bigger lens after that. So I pivoted to what became Medable in about 2016. And that really started to take a much bigger bite of the apple on how we create technology that can connect patients to healthcare and research.
Great. And what's the primary motivation? The inefficiencies in the clinical trial enterprise, or what was it? Where'd you get that clarity? Because that was a long time ago, and currently, obviously, we all know about the fragmentation in clinical trials and the inefficiencies. It's a relatively new realization, but you started on this path several years ago. What gave you that clarity?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say the first idea for it actually was in my medical school training at University of New Mexico, where you have this big rural population. And at University of New Mexico was one of the very first telemedicine projects called ECHO. And it was for treating people with hepatitis C. And it changed the lives of people with hepatitis C in New Mexico because it opened access to treatment in a way that really we had not seen before. And this was a population with a lot of hepatitis C burden. So I thought, wow, technology can change access for people who don't normally have access. So this idea was kind of cooking from there. Then I went to Stanford and I started to care for and research patients with systemic sclerosis and mixed connective tissue disease. And people would come in having not been diagnosed for 10 years in some cases. And oftentimes we would use medicines that were off-label applications. And we were some of the only people who kind of knew how to apply these medicines to specific clinical profiles. And we were also doing the research on these diseases. So that was when it solidified. And I thought, this idea of technology providing access, come on, we use it everywhere else, as we know, from every modern convenience. And I thought, this needs to get solved and it will really transform patients' lives and it would give us better research data. At the time, I was doing a research project that was in epigenetics of identical twins with systemic sclerosis. So I was calling dermatologists, rheumatologists, pulmonologists all over the world and just saying, do you have identical twins with systemic sclerosis? That was the only way for me to find and connect to patients. So those experiences made me think, we've got to solve this problem. And there were other tailwinds, like Apple Research Kit came out, I'd say a year after we launched the company. So it gave us signals we were onto something. I think that you need to have a vision, you need to have an insight, and then you need to have the technology leverage that makes it the right time to solve that problem. And between cloud and mobile, and then the insights and vision, it just kind of came together as the right time to really pursue this vision.
Sure. And at the time, there was a lot of skepticism among the clinical community and also a lot of clinical investigators when it comes to remote monitoring and even telemedicine. COVID, to a certain extent, changed that. It demystified telemedicine. How do you view that trajectory? Was there a lot of pushback initially? And if so, how did you manage it at the time?
Yeah, I think, people recognized that access to clinical research was clearly a problem. And no one was really questioning that. I think, decentralized trials kind of started to emerge pre-pandemic. There were examples of it being used years before. But to your point, it was really an edge case. And the main barrier was one that was, hey, we're used to doing it this way. And very select groups were willing to try a new way of working. And so our company, we were growing at kind of a typical early startup pace. We would have some early adopters. We would understand the problem a little bit better. And those early days we gained a lot of knowledge, but we certainly didn't have the majority of pharma saying, hey, we've got to do this a different way. And so what changed with the pandemic was this became kind of this existential requirement. The first month, I think we were wondering, will startups survive? What will happen? No one knew. Then in the second month, it was like, okay, we have a really important role to play. And suddenly we were hearing from so many different biopharma companies that needed and wanted to use our technology to even do things like change trials in flight to have these capabilities. All the way from launching new trials. And, the interesting thing about the pandemic was also the investigators were at home. So it was such a unique environment to be able to operate in. But I think given the stage of the company and given our fairly limited prior experience, I am proud to how we approached that. And we really just showed up and did everything we could do. Mm-hmm. Now I would say that growth phase was something that even our investors who've operated in many areas of technology, they've never seen anything like it. It was unprecedented. And so the pressure applied to our technology and our company was also unprecedented. And definitely there were things that didn't work or didn't go to plan. And those were really hard because we went in thinking, oh, we were going to save the day. And now, you've got someone, unable to open the app in one country and it working great in another country. These things that you don't see coming because we hadn't scaled to that, degree. But as we emerged from the pandemic and started to solve those and really went from let's say 5 to 10 clinical trials to over 100. We got this lens on the experience that was amazing from a learning perspective. And today, now we've, really harnessed that to become the company we are today. I'd say the industry also, I think, has become much more comfortable with adopting technology. Now, there was a reversion to kind of the status quo after the pandemic. But I think now what I'm seeing with AI is I believe the pandemic also prepared us to move faster with AI because it wasn't that long ago we had to really think differently. So, I think it is an industry that's conservative. It needs more creative destruction. And what I mean by that is just a full stop, rethink and replacement by something clearly better. But the pandemic certainly helped all of us think differently and see also the benefit of some of the new ways. Just one thing I'll kind of close with is, we did do some very extensive research with the Tufts Center for Drug Development on the trials that, we conducted during that phase. And we showed timeline reduction, protocol amendment reduction, and a significant ROI, 13x on decentralized clinical trials when you looked at phase 2 and then phase 3. So the research suggested the technology had real leverage, but I think in order to make it work for clinical study teams, there was still more room to go. And that's really where we focused over the last couple of years, making it easier than anything done before. But it was a really interesting period of time. It certainly gave us a very unique lens on the problem, and it helped, I think, advance the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess they say necessity is the mother of invention. And
adoption.
And adoption, in this case, when it comes to telemedicine. So you witnessed a shift in mindset during the pandemic. What about the investment community? Do you think they were ahead of the game? Do you think they were comfortable with remote monitoring and digital health solutions? Or do you think they also benefited from the manifestations of the pandemic? I've always been very curious to know how much groupthink there is in their investment decisions.
Yeah, it's such a great question. The early backers of Medable were really focused healthcare investors and people who, wanted to see healthcare change. And they were the biggest risk takers, right? So Launchpad Digital Health, HealthX, my early investors like Peter Leo, he's a dermatologist. He just believed that healthcare should change. Streamline Ventures was a non-healthcare focused fund who was an early backer of Medable. But, to your point, this was not kind of following the trend. These were people willing to evaluate something that looked very different than what was popular in that moment. And I'm forever grateful for those investors. And the list is much longer than, I'm immediately recalling. I would say that once it became clear that our company was growing, and in some cases at a rate that no one had seen in any sector. Like the company became really, the growth rate was very high. We were able to attract investors, who were looking for something where we were competing with every category. So I think that, from the outside, it probably looks like Silicon Valley follows certain trends, and that's to a certain degree true. I would say the challenge for any company is once you're attracting, the Blackstones and the Sapphire Ventures of the world. The other early investor in us was GSR Ventures. I mean, healthcare focused, amazing. But when I come to this other category, Sapphire, Blackstone, and Sapphire was a little bit earlier, we're competing with any type of company. And so therefore we have to be able to show that this is the right place to place your bet, whether it, instead of fintech, instead of you name it. And I would say that what was exciting about Medable was not only the growth and the financial performance of the company, but I think the vision and the mission really struck a chord with the investors who ended up investing in us. And to this day, those investors are the champions of our company and maintain a really long-term view on the opportunity to transform research. So I would say certainly there was a phase where it was like, we were really, really hot. And there were earlier days where we were not known by anyone, but we still had amazing investors who aligned with our vision.
Sure. That's great. It seems like you managed to gain their trust early on before digital monitoring and all the tools and technologies that you're working on were mainstream, because I think the pendulum swung probably a little too much after the pandemic because there was a lot of hubris also. And how did you manage to stay focused during that time when everyone was just throwing money at technology companies and a lot of companies raised a lot of money that unfortunately we're not able to deliver. And I can see why that becomes attractive to a lot of founders to just ride the momentum, and that can take them away from their primary goal and mission. How did you stay so focused during that time of hubris, if you will?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, as I think back on this, we have a really interesting comparator kind of period of time. So as we entered the pandemic, we were about to close with GSR Ventures, and, Sunny Kumar and Richard Lim are the principals we were working with there. And the pandemic hit and everyone was like, there's no way they're going to back the company. And I just forever am grateful. They believed in us with all this uncertainty, and we got that financing done. And that actually set us up to be able to do all the important work that we did in the pandemic. But at that point, it was a big question mark on what would happen to the economy, what would happen to research. So that was a period where it was like, we were really grateful and lucky to get that financing done. Then you get into the pandemic, and now suddenly we're taking off, right? We have customers, big customers, and the financiers and the investors are really excited about Medable. I think in that period, we had the opportunity to be very selective about, the investors we chose to work with. And a big part of what was important to me was alignment with the bigger mission of the company. And, Jensen Huang says the mission is the boss. And I believe that's true of everyone. That's my boss. That's our board's boss. Like, we're going after this big, important mission. And so as the pandemic, was underway and we were able to raise a lot of venture capital, we were still very selective. And why that mattered so much is, during the pandemic and after the pandemic, we had to make a lot of very, very hard decisions. One, a time when, capital was abundant, and then coming out of it, a time when capital was very scarce. So we needed people around the table who, again, come back to the mission and the importance of the mission. And that should be the guiding light for our decision making. And I would say, here we are today, the strongest we've ever been, having been the high times and then the times where capital was very scarce. And we had to really take our strategy in a new direction where it wasn't growth at all costs. And we were successful with with respect to what you were talking about, focus, because we maintained the priority of the vision and the mission. And that was really about how 10 years from now have we effectively solved this problem? And what are we doing today that's setting that foundation? And never just thinking about the problem right in front of you, but thinking about that longer term view. And I think that helped us make really, really hard decisions as, we came out of the pandemic and everything changed in the economy. And having the people around the table that we had, from the board members to the broader investors, we were able to do that. And I can't say every decision was the right decision, but as I look back, the majority have helped us get to where we are today. And I would say our technology is stronger than it's ever been. Our team is stronger than it's ever been. And we've just continued to be laser focused on the mission.
Sure. And so, Michelle, how do you ensure alignment with that mission across your company where, the company is growing and it's a very fast-paced environment? Is it about having the right people or the right processes in place?
Yeah, such a great question. So, we have something, our mission is to enable effective therapies to reach patients faster. But it's actually our vision, which we call our 1-1-in-1. And this is 1-day study startup, 1-day participant enrollment, 1-year study conduct. And this is like a full rewrite of how clinical trials are conducted. In our world, it's like saying we want to colonize Mars. And I make that comparison because when you put a goal that is so ambitious, what that does is it forces people to solve the problem in entirely new ways. So let's take the colonize Mars. If you want to colonize Mars, you have to have reusable rockets. Nobody thought we could have reusable rockets before, SpaceX. So when we think about the decisions we make, it is about that 1-1-in-1, something radically different than today. And, how do we get to a period of time where it's a year to do a full phase 3 trial? What does that mean? It means that we have to have more sensitive and specific endpoints. It means we have to be able to enroll ideally a smaller number of patients as a result of that, and that we can determine safety and efficacy much faster. So that means that the infrastructure to support that is totally different than what we're doing today. That is what guides our decision making and helps us make the foundational investments like the reusable rocket that are actually very different and not iterative on the status quo. So I think that what's really important is having this bold vision that is very different than where reality is today, because then you approach the problem with solutions that are non-iterative and are completely different than what you would otherwise go after.
Sure. Makes sense. So Michelle, can you walk us through how companies engage with Medable? Are they typically large pharma companies or smaller biotech? And what are the full spectrum of solutions that Medable offers?
So, we are, of course, active in the ecosystem, from working with CEO Roundtable to, you name the different organizations, from the Galen Foundation to CNS Summit, et cetera. We're out there, on a routine basis, making connections and meeting new people. I'd say, the majority of companies are approaching us, and what they're trying to solve for is faster clinical trial timelines and higher quality data, better site and patient experience. It's kind of those 4 things or some subset. And when we engage with a partner, we are looking at, what is the program around this therapy and this intervention, and how can we align your clinical operations with your digital strategy for that program? And what's been super exciting is we have partners like GSK has been a very vocal partner of ours, where we're working, upstream of a single protocol and really thinking about how do we optimize the patient and site experience? How do we optimize the data? How can we run a number of clinical trials that are actually going to get acceleration of these key outcomes? And those solutions are anything from, consent to screening and enrollment tools, core data collection tools and eCOA, access tools such as telemedicine and sensors, and then being able to really create that design that can be deployed quickly, but yet tailored for the nuances of the individual protocols. And it's been so exciting. Every year I go to ASCO and I see our customers and partners up there talking about the trials that we've, supported. I see the blockbuster weight loss drugs and the impact it's had, across so many different diseases and conditions. And we've been a part of that. And sometimes I just have to pinch myself because I think, how did we even get here? How did I get to be a part of these incredible breakthroughs? Now, our role isn't, I can't say we're the heroes. It's really our customers. It's ultimately the patients and the sites. But to be a part of it is like the greatest joy. And our team celebrates every one of these because, we know so much hard work went into being able to be a part of it and then serving that research effort and to make it successful, even sometimes when the therapies aren't, for those patients and those participants who are enrolled in the trial.
Michelle, what phase of a study do you think is most compatible with the solutions that Medable offers? Is it along the entire spectrum from phase 1 to phase 3, or do you think there's a sweet spot?
When you look at digital for, clinical research, I think you can use it effectively throughout that kind of drug development life cycle, even post-approval. The majority of our work is in phase 2 and phase 3. And I think the reason is that the adoption of our platform, again, is at this programmatic level, and our partners are trying to look to accelerate those phase 2 and phase 3 trials. What's exciting now is some of our research efforts are rolling over into phase 4. Or, what we've been doing in rare disease is now rolling over into long-term follow-up. And it's actually, changing the way that we can do long-term follow-up and making it patient-centric when you were talking about a 10 to 15-year timeline on some of these studies. So it really is mostly phase 2, phase 3. I'm very excited about transforming long-term follow-up because I think there's a big unmet need. That status quo creates costs that are actually limiting cell and gene therapy. And by making long-term follow-up something that's more affordable for our sponsors and more patient-friendly, and patient-centric, I think we can really help, support cell and gene research. So, but yeah, most of our research is phase 2, phase 3, and mostly actually it's like 11 therapeutic areas, 14 over the last 3 years. Oncology, cardiometabolic disease, rare disease, are some of the top areas that we look in.
Great. So how does this new paradigm that Medable is advancing is helping patients, making things easier for patients?
I think, again, coming back to why we started Medable, it was all about enabling access for individual participants and patients. And I think that when, from decentralized clinical trials having become more mainstream, now, even when it's not called DCT, the majority of our studies incorporate remote patient participation options. So it's kind of merged with ECOA, but then you bring into it these access strategies. And when I look across the, spectrum of our studies, we can show that we have over 90% patient retention and adherence to protocol. And we benchmark that against, a lot of established data. It does show that technology moves the needle. And that research is ongoing, and we'll have a number of new publications coming out with the Tufts Center for Drug Development, even showing improvement in the diversity profile of the participant base. So, I think one is access for patient populations that we know should have access. And then 2 is providing an experience that enables people to complete the research effort. And we're showing we can meaningfully move the needle on both of those. As we look forward, what's really exciting to me is how can we use AI to even give a more personalized and tailored experience to participants and make sure that they have the support that they need in real time? Is they're not only doing clinical research, right? They're performing the activities of their lives. They're receiving healthcare. They're doing a lot of things. So I think there's a big opportunity there, but certainly we've moved the needle on the diversity element of clinical research and patient retention and adherence to protocol.
So AI is, the hot topic of the day, and it seems like you have been incorporating AI into the tools that you're developing. I believe last year you launched Medable AI, if I'm not mistaken. How is AI helping you in Medable, and where do you think this AI movement is going when it comes to streamlining clinical trials and providing access to both care and research to patients?
Yeah, one of our big learnings emerging from the pandemic was no 2 trials are the same. And when we saw where our platform was failing, it was around these individual needs, right? We could say do 90% of the trial from our core platform, but then there would be 10% that was just for that protocol. And we had this epiphany that maybe we could use AI to create a platform solution that brought consistency and quality to that protocol specific, code base and platform requirement. So we incorporated AI to essentially solve that 10% delta that we saw as individual protocol. And that was really Medable AI first. It was take an individual protocol, use our platform, and create this global, reliable, highly specific workflow in, sometimes like 30 languages, and deploy that into the field. And AI helped us bring our timelines internally from deploying a solution for a clinical trial from 16 weeks to 1 week. And the quality and performance of that software was like almost 100 times better than the human configuration of the same solution. So it really opened our eyes to, okay, strategically, this is where humans should be operating, solving the big, hard, meaty problems. But the tactical rote, 1,000-point workflow configuration, we could use LLMs to do this complex workflow orchestration and get a higher quality output than any human would be able to yield. So that was our first insight. And Medable Studio has Medable AI, and it's really about using LLMs for complex workflow orchestration in a deterministic way. So you're not necessarily using generative AI, but you're using those complex orchestrators. Right. Now where we're going with it, which has been so exciting, is we can launch an ECOA with AI and have DCT elements. So you're getting outcome science compliance, and access. You're getting a very specific protocol specific digital solution. And we're launching that in a week. And we're able to now serve biotech companies that frankly we couldn't serve because we couldn't align with the price because it was too costly for us to implement the software.
Right.
And now we're serving some of the most cutting edge biotech companies in the world. It's been so transformative, supporting the research that we want to be able to support because we can do it in a cost effective way. So that epiphany around where AI can outperform humans and then how we can leverage our team for the much harder, bigger strategic goals has opened our eyes to where agentic AI can go to play a very similar role in clinical operations more broadly. There are a lot of things that happen in clinical operations, around the patient, around the site, around the data that is very routine and rote for humans. So we're, launching an agentic capability later this year that's going to help bring forward to our partners some of the benefits we've seen internally with our own use of Medable AI. I think, kind of coming to this big challenge around clinical development, 90% of the budget, 90% of the work is still human services. It's been felt we can't shed technology light into that because it's too complex. And I think agentic AI will actually help us open the door to technology solutions we never had or were feasible before. And we're looking to do that with our goals in mind, which is around ensuring, amazing experiences for patients and sites and being able to accelerate clinical research.
That's remarkable, Michelle. And you mentioned something that I'd like to underscore, that you're using LLMs in a deterministic way to constrain them to a certain extent so that they don't hallucinate and they don't give you convincing outputs that may not be true.
Yeah, exactly. And, with our industry, and you're thinking, patient data, patient lives, data for regulatory submission, I think that's where that whole system, you want to really know exactly where and how you're using AI. So we have found, these LLMs, when you give them a set of specifications on, hey, configure this software system, be able to aggregate this data and show us the chain of thinking across these rules and these parameters, you can get real high fidelity outcomes and answers, outputs. And I think it's a really important, kind of set of guardrails to have in place as we kind of figure out how to use more of the generative capabilities for our work.
I always say that a clinical trial is nothing more than an exercise in data collection, especially late phase studies. And it's so remarkable how inefficient the existing system is. Why do you think that's the case, given the fact that generating clinical evidence is so critical to drug development across all therapeutic areas, and now increasingly for folks that are developing AI tools that they have to clinically validate. In many cases, they have to conduct clinical studies to validate their AI tools. Currently, most of the AI tools that we see that have been approved by the FDA have been cleared through the 510K pathway, which is based on a predicate. Unfortunately, payers don't take those clearances seriously. They never convince guideline folks to include them in their recommendations. Why is something so important, so inefficient, and obviously something that you're focusing on? But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about what happened and how did this get away from us?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And, I'm going to have to say you, in a conversation we had years ago, really helped shape my thinking on this. And it was, let's start with the label. Let's start with the vision for what we're trying to provide evidence against, and start with the most simple, effective view on what the data needs to be. And so that would be the ideal state. I think to answer your question on why it gets so complicated, oftentimes, we have complexity because we might be complicating where we're going with that label claim and not keeping the purest approach in mind. The other part from where complexity comes in is the human part of this. I always look at this with Medable. Human complexity, the size of teams, is a nonlinear complexity generator. So, the complexity of 5 people versus 10 people, it's not a 2x delta, 10 people versus 20 people. It really is nonlinear. So I think that the complexity comes from solving the problem and making the problem too complex from the get-go, and then layering in this human element that is nonlinear complexity with the more humans involved. So let's say, what does that mean for the future? For the future, I think we still continue to take the cleanest and simplest approach to the right evidence and evidentiary data. And we have humans operating in really strategic roles, and we're using AI to minimize the compounding complexity of humans doing the routine work that actually makes things harder, not easier. As we saw in our own software implementation, sometimes we have 5 people working on it. Now we have one LLM and one person. The outcomes are higher quality, faster, and less cost intensive. So, I think the complexity is twofold, and we need to be able to say, is this the right evidentiary data? Are we actually creating complexity? We have data we don't need. We're solving for, if it doesn't work, we're still going to be able to claim X, Y, and Z, or it doesn't work perfectly, we can still ensure we have this data, which I don't think is the ultimate pursuit, and the compounding impact of human complexity. So I believe the future will actually give us a clearer view of what that evidentiary data needs to be when we look at AI and leveraging a global corpus of knowledge. And then secondarily, we can reduce the complexity by having a smaller number of humans operating in a strategic zone and limiting the tactical rote work that's being done and offloading that to AI. I hope that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And that's, I'm assuming, one of the reasons you're advancing the agentic AI platform, because that could essentially automate the repetitive and somewhat predictable mechanics of the enterprise and how we conduct clinical trials. And I'm assuming that a lot of those functions humans don't enjoy doing anyway, because they have to do with checking boxes, making sure that everything is aligned with the protocol, and copying and pasting data sets, which are not, frankly, fulfilling endeavors anyway.
Yeah, and that's been our research. When we talk to, say, we're talking to CRAs, what did you love about your job and what really gives you burnout? And it's these things that are repetitive and redundant, and you're not operating at the top of your job description or talent set, that I think we can also minimize burnout. So yeah, the human element of clinical research today is a compounding complexity when it comes to the operational side. I think there's a huge opportunity to get people more strategic positions and more leverage, and then take the things that are leading to burnout and reduce that compounding complexity and actually create a system that works better.
So it seems like you have essentially automated and distilled the core functions of a regulatory grade clinical study into essentially what ends up in the FDA label as a registrational study. And then you are automating the various steps using the agentic platform that you're developing to get there. It's a very elegant view of the ecosystem, because it in a way simplifies what we need to do to make clinical trials more efficient, because there's so many different moving parts. And in fact, I realize now that you mentioned this, looking back at my experience at the FDA, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the data generated within a single clinical trial, and from the same company. And these companies could be quite well versed in the world of clinical research. It's never consistent. It's actually much messier than people think.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for, succinctly kind of summarizing our view and what we're going after. I think, it's just such an exciting future also because, when we look at how we accelerate clinical trials, approaching it the same way we've approached it for the last couple decades isn't going to get us a different outcome. And one of our kind of guiding principles as we leverage agentic AI is give the superheroes superpowers. Everyone in this industry is doing it because they believe this is important work. This is very hard work. People at the FDA, people working in pharma sponsor companies, working in CROs, there's nothing easy about any of these jobs. So we're thinking, how do we give individuals, these superheroes, these superpowers, and really get them more leverage in their day-to-day.
You mentioned the conversation we had a few years ago about the FDA label, and this is something that again occurred to me when I was at the FDA, when we start to notice that a lot of companies, even large biopharmaceutical companies that are very experienced, do a lot of things that don't really matter to the FDA. They're not requirements. But what we kept hearing from these companies was that, our CRO says that this is an FDA requirement. So that told me two things: that there might be a middle layer that knowingly or unknowingly is complicating matters when it comes to clinical trials. And two, perhaps the FDA hasn't done a good job specifying the requirements. Do you think we have sort of this middle layer, an ecosystem of actors? Some people say it's rent-seeking behavior that are complicating the matters.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, part of it is that we do have a system that incentivizes, more labor and more hours. And I think that, needs to get fixed, and we need to be able to say, what's the outcome, and deliver that outcome efficiently and effectively. So I do think there's the incentives need to be aligned with what's ultimately going to get the participant and the outcomes for the patient populations faster. I'd say the other part of it that we see is I don't even think that this is a matter of it being, anything nefarious or, seeking, additional opportunity for certain companies, but it's people are really excited about the research process, and they're excited about the potential. So it's like, well, let's also look at how this type of data could help us. And that excitement can lead to complexity, I think, and additional data that might not actually be necessary. So I've taken this idea that you provided me years ago and come back to our partners and say, okay, let's work from the label backward. And then anything we add that's not necessarily supportive of that, let's make sure the juice is worth the squeeze. So we're not adding undue site burden. We're not adding undue patient burden. And when we do add that tax, we know it's really worth it. I think this idea is an important one that you put forward. And I think it's ultimately how the FDA thinks about it. It can be a clarifying approach to creating that evidentiary strategy.
Speaking of the FDA and ex-US regulatory authorities, are there any regulatory bottlenecks in the work that you do? And if so, can you outline some of those?
Sure. So, one of the areas that I think is totally ripe for, optimization is around being able to create new endpoints, validate them, and have them accepted as primary or secondary endpoints. I think we should be able to do that faster. If we want more sensitive and specific measures, we need to create a system that can accept those new measures faster. It's going to have enormous benefit. And where we are today with AI, whether it's on, imaging analysis or sensors and digital biomarkers or composite endpoints, we need to get those endpoints into the system when we think they're good, and we need to get them to be known to be a new approach that's accepted. That's one. I would say, we're doing a lot more work with Chinese biotechs. And the thing that I noticed there is that those studies enroll predictably and they enroll very fast. Now, I think there's a lot of questions as to why and how the United States can become more competitive and the rest of the world can become more competitive. But it does seem like that's the infrastructure certainly leads to faster patient enrollment, and that the regulatory ecosystem has, created more ease in the regulatory approach to get those approvals faster. Now, it does seem that the United States is looking at that and saying we got to do better and think differently. So I think that's really positive. But between, what we're seeing in China and the infrastructure being faster and a faster regulatory pathway, it's creating pressure on the system to take new approaches.
Right. Yeah, this is a theme that we've also heard at the CEO Roundtable. The CEO of one of our member companies during a recent meeting we had said that there's about 70% of their studies today are outside the U.S. 5 years ago, it was the other way around. The majority of their studies were in the U.S. And she cited many factors, but primarily the fragmentation across the health systems that we have and all the contractual agreements. And have you seen that across the U.S.? Is that fragmentation real, meaning that different institutions, when they even want to work on the same protocol, have different requirements, different contractual agreements? And to what extent is that a problem?
Yeah, it's a great point. And, I remember the conversation at the CEO roundtable around site contracting and like the variability in the timelines for getting those agreements in place. I think we're a little downstream from that right now in what we're doing, but we definitely see a lot of site to site variability. And I think as we, are able to take a more informed view on optimizing site performance and understanding and predicting site performance, ideally we're able to solve some of those problems in advance of the study being started. So, how can we make those sites be able to do research more easily? And how can we remove some of those challenges and barriers? But definitely what we see is a lot of site-to-site variability. And I'd say then that extrapolates to country variability, kind of like what I described in the observations with China and just the speed and predictability of patient enrollment.
Right. One of the exercises that we did when I was at the FDA was trying to understand what are the determinants of a reliable clinical trial site. And we looked at various elements, how many patients they recruit, how many studies they manage at the same time, the experience of the investigator. There was really no correlation between any of that, including the experience of the investigator and the quality of the data that they produced. So that was important to us because we wanted to know which clinical trial sites to inspect. So the Office of Scientific Investigations did a lot of work on trying to understand the profile of clinical trial sites and its set of metrics that would speak to their quality. We always fell back on just inspecting sites that enrolled the most patients because none of those factors correlated. To me, what was surprising was the experience of the investigator.
Yeah, that was kind of surprising.
Yeah, I guess maybe that has to do with the fact that more experienced investigators have more studies that they manage. That maybe distracts them. That's just my hypothesis. What have you seen in your experience? What do you think are the primary factors for clinical site quality and the data that's generated?
Yeah, ultimately, I believe it has to do with the site staff and, of course, the investigator, and then the simplicity of the protocol. So, if the protocol is extremely complex, it's going to be hard on the ground to execute that research effort. So it can fail because you've created a lot of complexity that ultimately is just hard to execute. maybe there are a number of blood draws, a number of imaging. You're adding sensors that are hard to onboard the patient for. You're asking the patient and participants to come back to the site very frequently. There are workflows in there. So the protocol is a big driver, I think. I would say at the site level, then I think it from what I can see, it does have to do with that site staff and the investigator. I would say something we have found is making our sites operate in software effectively is making sure we have an in-country support personnel and that we're coaching and showing sites how to use software in advance of the study. So there are small things you can do up front. It's kind of like a stitch in time saves 9. But I just think of my own work as a dermatologist. I still see patients in a monthly clinic that I run. Mm-hmm. And like the quality of that clinic comes down to the team around me and their experience and familiarity with the efforts we have underway, complex procedures, research protocols, whatever those things are. You want that team supporting you to be really familiar with what needs to happen on the day-to-day basis.
That's a great point, Michelle. Actually, that got me thinking that the FDA analysis that we did, we looked at the investigators' scientific acumen and experience, how many papers they've published. But I guess we should have probably looked at how good of a manager they are because they have to manage a team. That's probably harder to measure, but we looked at their scientific output.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, from my experience clinically, sometimes it's really that supporting team.
Right.
Who's in the room with you and how familiar are they and how long have you worked together is kind of one of the drivers.
Sure. And how well you can manage the team.
And how well
you stay focused.
Yep. And make sure that you can go with, you're managing signal to noise.
Goes back to the fact that it's the ability to manage the process and the various aspects of a clinical trial, which hopefully your agentic AI will solve autonomously.
I hope so.
So Michelle, a little bit of a pivot. As a female CEO in biotech and health tech, you are unfortunately still in the minority. And what responsibility, if any, do you feel that you have to other women entrepreneurs in this space?
It's interesting, Sean, because it's not something I think about often. However, I'm a big believer that when you see someone you can relate to do something, you suddenly really believe deeply in your subconscious you can do it too. And so, something I want to spend more time on and try to spend time on is, there's really nothing outside of determination that sets me apart. That and willingness to take risk. So, something I'd love for entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs to know is an understanding of the problem, determination, and a willingness to go for it will really get you much farther than you think. So when it comes to other women and, really anyone who doesn't represent the status quo in entrepreneurship, I think I do feel that I want people to know that, it's achievable. You can go for it. You can do it. And sometimes also the thing people don't talk about is it's actually the failures where you learn the most. And the experience itself will just teach you so much and take you so far. So I want more women to be CEOs, to be entrepreneurs, and I want women to believe in their bones they can do it by seeing, someone with all their flaws and as well talents like me and being able to relate to that and feel like, okay, she can do it, I can do it. That would be my ultimate kind of hope for, other entrepreneurs.
I love how you characterize it. Really don't focus on yourself, focus on the vision and the mission and build conviction and put everything you have in it.
Yeah. And I think it kind of is like this idea that the mission is the boss. It's It really does help people understand it's not any one person. It's not me. It's not, XYZ C-level or project manager. We're all in this as a team. And the mission is what's dictating, our priorities. With that said, I think, I do have to show up and lead the way and make a lot of hard decisions. And, I'm glad I have a team around me to help me on that process, but I'm also glad I've kind of learned how to do it and continue to aspire to get better at it.
And this is something that I hadn't thought enough about. A leader, and especially an entrepreneur, has to be essentially selfless.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I really think one of the things that has helped me navigate really hard times is that I'm not in this for my own, kind of my own success, or monetary outcome, or you name it. I really believe what we're doing is important. And I think we have an important role to play. And that kind of comes back to this idea of stay in the game. Because then I know if we can continue to work on this day after day and harness those learnings, fast forward several years, we're going to be much farther than we thought. So that's what really motivates me beyond anything is just that mission and being able to say we meaningfully made progress against it. It's helped me make some of the hardest decisions and do things I didn't want to do and do things that didn't really actually benefit me, but benefited the mission, And I think you've got to take that lens if you want to build something that really changes the future.
My last question. So if someone listening to this as a family member with a serious disease looking for a clinical trial, or a researcher that's really frustrated with the current system, what's the one thing that you want them to know about what's possible today?
What excites me so much, Sean, and you probably see this in your experience as a clinician, the system isn't great about necessarily providing a participant or patient with every opportunity. What I believe is that we are surrounded by information that can help guide us. So, coming to your doctor with ideas, having your family members join your visits, and spending the time understanding it on your own is actually important. As a patient myself, I've experienced that. So we live in the information age, and AI is going to augment our personal abilities to navigate the healthcare system. And I think that's important. And to do that with families, and to know, there are companies out there who are aspiring to change this and make it better. But I do think, we do as individual participants in the healthcare system need to take an empowered approach. And thankfully, the ability to do that is improving every day.
Michelle, thank you so much for your time. And this was a fantastic discussion.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's so exciting. I'm so glad we could revisit your wisdom on let's work backwards from the label. It's helped me in many different